Well, good afternoon. Well, as Bruce said, what I'd like to talk to you about today is some of the archaeological findings that took place at Plenty Coup Park, and then how we might be able to understand those in the larger cultural context of chiefs, and especially Crow chiefs. So when we look at feasting in Crow society, it's basically broken down into two types of public feeds. One is what's called a commensal feed, or empowering feeds, and what those are is using protocols that pre-exist in the society, in any human society, that surround the production and consumption of food. Then societies will use those in different ways to bring about some other end. So in Crow society, the place where we see that the most is what are called clan feeds, and I'll get into those in a minute. But, human societies do this around the world. So like weddings. Weddings are a really good example of this, where food is used to bring two families together and then to begin the process of developing a new relationship out of that. The other types of feeds or feasts is what's called a patron roll feast. These are feasts in which a leader is using food to make sure that his followers or patrons will stick with him and follow what he is requesting of them. And in fact, it's such an integral part of politics that that followers of a particular leader expect these kinds of feeds. All right, so then when we look at the history of feasts for chiefs, there's a lot of accounts that are written by travelers, even government officials, trading post operators, and so on, trappers, that talk about the chiefs and the fact that they would have public feasts for their followers. And many times they've actually recorded the speech that was given by the chief at that point, but they don't really tell us about the feed itself. What kinds of foods are served, in what manner are they served, what possible meanings the various kinds of dishes that are served might have had for crows. But with the archaeological work that's been done at Plenty Coup Park, we're able to, and examining contemporary feeds, I think we're able to put together what kinds of foods were being consumed. Okay, so we have to start out with looking at the historic diet of the Crow people. And it was primarily a meat diet, heavy meat diet, with a special emphasis, of course, on buffalo, but the other game animals as well. But aside from the meat, what crows particularly relish then and now are the organ meats. So the way that meat is generally prepared, kidneys and liver were, and often still are, eaten raw, or then roasted over coals, and then the heart, the tongue, ribs, and some of the fresh meat is cooked over an open fire. And then the vast majority of meat was historically jerked and then dried, and then in some cases pulverized to make what's called dried meat. Supplementing the diet were different kinds of berries and roots. So choke cherries in particular, and wild carrot, which is called yampa, prairie potatoes, turnips, wild turnips. Some of these items would be eaten fresh, but in some cases, they would be cooked into, so like for the berries, cooked in what is called Indian pudding, or the roots would be added to stews or broths. And then sometimes the berries would be mashed and dried as patties for later consumption, and then also mixed with fat and the dry meat to make what's called irsha, or pemmican. Now, every society has its specialties, its food specialties, and one that is particularly relished by Crow people is called Xibola. And what Xibola is a sausage, and it's made by cleaning the large intestine and then removing the casing from the large intestine, and then the casing is cleaned, and then tenderloin from the buffalo or nowadays cow is put into it's made into strips, it's not ground, and then put into the casing, and then first it's cooked over a fire, and then right before consumption it's boiled. Now, the stomach and intestines are particularly important to the Crow diet, and it's seen as an important, the consumption of the stomach and intestines is seen as a very important part of Crow identity. In fact, because of the fact that it's so much a part of the diet. So each part of the stomachs, the 4 stomachs of the cow or the buffalo, are utilized. And so the first one is icha. Icha is boiled and then cut into, historically, was cut into little pieces and then used as chewing gum. And back in the day, during the buffalo days, a woman who could make the icha pop, the way some people pop gum, was thought to be attractive. So there's actually a story about the sun and the moon having a debate over who are the prettiest women on earth. And the sun says frog women are the prettiest women on earth. And the moon says human women are the prettiest women on earth. And the sun says, how can you say that? They don't like me. I think they're ugly. And the brother says, why do you think they don't like you? And he says, because every time they look at me, they make ugly faces. But anyway, so they have this debate, and they bring one woman from each up to the sky, a frog and a human woman. And the mother of the two challenges the girls to different things, the women to different things. And one of them is chewing icha. So the human woman can make the icha pop because she has teeth, but the frog can't. So the frog puts rocks and charcoal from the fire in her mouth to try to get the icha to pop, but then it just looks worse because it's coming out of her mouth. So the sun agrees, human women are prettier than frog women. But that's icha. And then the reptilium, Apsáalooke, is what we typically call tripe, the honeycomb tripe. And this is boiled into the delicacy Xibola. And Xibola is basically just boiled tripe. It's just a soup. The Xibola is the many folds stomach, and this is what typically, like my grandfather who was a cowboy, he called it the Bible, because it looks like the pages of a worn book when it's before it's stripped. So it would be boiled, and then the interior lining would be eaten. And then the last one, irisha. Irisha is the blue or the marrow gut intestine and or stomach. It's cut into strips, and nowadays people cook it over a barbecue, and it's what Crow people today call Indian hot dogs. It's extremely bitter, but it's eaten. So all of the parts of the stomach are important to Crow people. Okay, so what are contemporary feasts today? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, okay. I don't know if it's... Okay. Is that better? Okay. All right, so for feasts today, we have basically two kinds. One is what are called clan feeds, and these are ones in which somebody is, or the family is actually feeding the person's father's clan. In Crow society, crows are matrilineal, so they inherit their clan and their family relations from their mothers. But the father's clan is thought of as the one that will provide prayers and encouragement for the child. So when the child wants to do something, like go to college or whatever it might be, then the father's clan members are invited for a meal, for a feast. And then when the child accomplishes something, like graduates from college, then the same thing is done. The clan relatives, or the father's clan members, are brought in and they're fed as a way of thanking them for the prayers that were provided and the encouragement before. So so when we look at clan feeds, this is that idea of relying on commensal protocols, how food is treated, what kinds of foods are served, and so on, to bring about some type of a relationship for an individual. So clan feeds, typically the members of the father's clan are invited and food is prepared, and then usually at the conclusion of it, then they're given material gifts. The idea is that by giving material gifts and providing food to father's clan's relatives or members, then they will in turn provide spiritual things, spiritual prayers and encouragement for the individual. So what kinds of foods are served at clan feeds? This is actually put together as a joke, but it does actually address the major foods that are today provided at clan feeds. So boiled ribs and the whole beef's innards, and then Xibola, the sausage, Xibola, the boiled tripe, and then the marrow gut, the Indian hot dog, the heart, kidneys, and its tongue. So right here in this, even though a Crow person put this together as kind of a joke, they are actually specifically pointing out the kinds of foods that are important to Crow people. Okay, so what kinds of foods are served at clan feeds today? There are usually hot dogs, hamburgers, steaks, but baked beans, fry bread or pan bread, and then various kinds of salads, potato salad, jello salad, etc. But today at clan feeds, there'll be at least one, if not two, of the traditional foods, of the specific kinds of foods that are seen as status foods, as important foods. So these are typically the tongue and the kidneys and Xibola and the Xibola and the marrow gut, Indian hot dogs. Okay. Now, the other kind of public feasting that we see happening in Crow society today are public rallies. So somebody's running for some office, and they'll have feeds in the different districts and different communities on the reservation. And the kinds of things that they are expected to serve are steaks, and then the specialty dishes, organ meats especially, ribs, and then the Xibola. Xibola is such a time-consuming dish to make that when it does show up at either a clan feed or at a public rally, then that scene is like really going the extra step. So it's pretty rare to see it. In fact, it's more likely to see it at a clan feed than it is at a public rally. And in fact, people will criticize or judge candidates for particular offices based on what they serve and when they serve it and how much they serve of it. So, now if we look at Plenty Coups specifically, the archaeological work was undertaken there in the early 90s, and some of the items that were found during that process do provide us with some ideas of what Chief Plenty Coups was doing for his public feasts. All right, so who was Plenty Coups? Plenty Coups was the last principal leader of the Crow tribe. And in that position, he becomes the transitional chief for the Crow people, the leader who leads the Crow people from what we could call the Buffalo days into reservation life. And he took his job very seriously, as we can see through a number of different efforts that he undertook. And by the time he was in his mid-40s, the Crows were permanently on a reservation. And he lives into his 80s. It's actually that time period that becomes the most critical in his life. So when he is living in the house and the community of Pryor has been established, is when he takes on his biggest role as a political leader. And even though he may have established his authority through military activity, historically Crow leaders had to prove that they could be leaders by attaining 4 specific war honors: touching a live enemy in battle, taking an enemy's weapons, taking an enemy's horse, and then leading a successful war party. A successful war party is one that goes against the enemy, gains evidence of their action, and then returns without any injury or death to their own party. That's a successful war leader. Once an individual did that, then they were considered a chief. But it's the actions that they do after that that proves whether they really are a leader or not. Are they generous? Are they diplomatic? Are they able to negotiate internally and externally for the best interests of their own people? Those types of things. So that's what we see with Plenty Coups. He proved himself to be a warrior, and he accomplished the 4 war deeds necessary to be a chief, but it's actually his actions afterwards that prove what kind of a leader he was. So in 1880, Plenty Coups agreed or wished to have his home become a park for all people to enjoy. And the initial house, which is this central part here, was a 1.5 story high, and then additions through the years were added on. Whoops. Well, there we go. First this part, and then an extension on the back here. He was originally allotted 320 acres of land, and then in 1928 he donated 190 acres to a park, okay, which is now a state park. All right, so when we look at the structures that existed at the time that the chief was alive, this is what was there. So we have buggy sheds and basically a saddle shed here. This was a store, which is still there. And then to the west were corrals, or to the east, I'm sorry. And then the house itself. And then here's the spring, and then there was a sweat lodge by the spring. It's this area right here that I'm terming a courtyard that becomes of most interest to public feeds. Most of the time, the chief and his wives stayed in this area, in this sort of courtyard area by the house. And typically a wall tent was there, or even a teepee. Even after frame structures or cabins had been built for Crow people, they still preferred to live in teepees or wall tents. And in fact, they thought of that living inside of a structure, like a frame house or a log cabin, was actually unhealthy. And in fact, it was, because of tuberculosis. So they preferred to stay outside, especially the people who lived all their lives in teepees. Preferred to stay outside. So that's what we have going on here. Here's Chief Plenty Coups sitting outside the wall tent. This is his niece, Iva Bulltail, who took care of him in the latter part of his life. And this is Iva's daughters trying to hide, I think, from the camera. But here we can see the whole thing all together. So here's the house, there's the courtyard area, the buggy shed, and so on. Iva Bulltail's youngest brother was a man named John Bulltail. And when he was a little boy, 5, 6 years old, he was actually being raised by his sister, who had sons that were about his age. And fortunately, I got to know John Bulltail and interview him during this process. And I asked him about where did Plenty Coups have his public feeds? And so he described that people would sit in this area between the buggy shed and the house. All right, so now the archaeological work that was done at the courtyard area, the park wanted to put in fire suppression equipment into the house. And essentially what that would mean was that a water pipe would be put across, basically right through the center of the courtyard area. And so archaeological work was undertaken to make sure that process wouldn't disturb, or if it did, what was there. Okay, and what was found was a significant amount of food, or debris from food. So seeds from berries, and then different kinds of bone from basically rib. A lot of it was rib bone. Some of it was professionally butchered, and others was what we could call home butchered. Okay, so then I think, let's see, and then also what was found were different kinds of dishes, or at least the parts of dishes. All right, the food was concentrated, or the food items as such, were concentrated in one of the archaeological squares and one of the test pits, which is marked as Shovel Pit 7, which was near the center of the courtyard area. And in here was a part, when they did the excavation, it revealed part of a hearth, and then around it were the different kinds of debris. So we have the hearth, shards from at least 8 serving bowls and platters, 120 choke cherries, seeds, 22 juneberry, etc., the ribs, some of them professionally done and others that were home butchered, and then miscellaneous bones, cattle bones. So this is what they look like. This shows us the types of items that were coming out of rib bone, professionally butchered rib bone, pieces of plates. And this says Cleveland, China on it. And my wife is a professional second-hand or garage store kind of person, and she found one. It's a China plate platter. And then here we have rib bones that were butchered in what we could call home butchering. So you can see it's been hit with an axe 2 or 3 times till it broke. And then this is clearly a professionally butchered rib bone. Now, it might be surprising to some of you that crows were using European types of dishes, but in fact, by the early 1900s, crow women liked to have dishes. So we have this famous photo of a crow family and crow agency sitting at their dinner table with various kinds of dishes. And then this was a photo taken of the interior of a teepee right after a family had had a meal. So again, showing the use of European types of china. What kinds of foods did Plenty Coups serve? And I asked this question of John Bulltail, and he remembered that they ate fresh meat and then Xibola. And he makes a point of saying that Xibola is very important to crows. In fact, he felt that crow people were healthier in the past when they ate more Xibola than they do today. And then I asked him how the food was prepared, and he said the women of the family would bring a cow to the trees behind the house, which are actually still there. And there they would kill it and cut it up and then roast it over the fire. And then I asked him specifically, is there anything particular that the chief liked to eat? And he reiterated ribs and that were purchased at Edgar, at the mercantile store in Edgar. So, okay, now we actually have some historic documents. The way that crow people, especially crow people who weren't literate, did business was that if they'd go to a store, then they would be given credit, and then that store once a month would send its receipts to the Bureau of Indian Affairs Office and Crow Agency, and then money would be drawn out to pay those bills based on the revenue of that particular individual. So because of that, we have receipts from the big store, mercantile store in Edgar, showing when the chief would go over there to buy things, buy food and so on. And over here we have kind of a typical purchase: matches, sugar, coffee, etc. He particularly liked tomatoes and bread. Almost every time he goes to the store, he's either buying fresh or canned tomatoes. And this really kind of puzzled me for a little while. It's a little bit off track here, but it kind of puzzled me for a while. And so I asked some of the older people, and they said that they remembered that their fathers or grandparents particularly relished having tomatoes over bread, which is actually something that my father still enjoys to this day. So Chief Plenty Coups must have picked that up. But over here, we have a type of a purchase that only occurs about once a month or every other month. There's some basic stuff on this one: oats, milk, so on. But right here, meat, $35, almost $36 worth of meat. That's a lot of meat in 1931. Like a prime rib steak in Billings cooked at a restaurant in 1931 was $3. So this is a large amount of meat, maybe as much as 150 pounds worth of meat. And the chief, of course, didn't have any kind of refrigeration, so this meant that this meat had to be either dried or eaten as soon as he got back to Pryor, which suggests to me that what he's doing is buying meat for a public feed. There's no really any other explanation for why he would buy so much at one time. So why did Plenty Coups have public feeds? Well, his primary reason was to assert his authority. So that idea of the patron role feed, and to maintain solidarity among his people, especially in the face of the assimilative policies that were existing at that time by the United States government. I asked John Bulltail if he remembered anything in particular that the chief talked about, but he said he was just a little boy. The only thing he could really remember was that the men seemed to talk forever while he went around and played with his relatives and friends. But he said he would always notice that towards the end of the evening or the end of the day, that after everybody had talked, the chief would get up and tell them what they were going to do. So in that sense, it's almost like a coach working with his staff, right? The coach is willing to listen to what his staff has to say, or any leader, but ultimately it's his responsibility to make the decisions on what will happen. Okay, and we have a number of different sort of sound bites from Plenty Coup, and they very consistently talk about the changing times, how lifestyles are changing because of the reservation, and because of Europeans or Euro-Americans coming into Crow territory. And they do tend to be directed towards trying to make his followers understand that they needed to take care of themselves, even in the face of the kinds of adversity that was going on. So, like the first one where he tells them they've just got to get over the fact that the buffalo aren't around anymore, and they need to take care of themselves and get to work. The most famous one is, which is quoted constantly, with what the white man knows, he can oppress us. If we learn what he knows, then he can never oppress us again. His last known public words were actually seem to be referencing at least eating, if not public feasting. And so he said, eat the meat and the potatoes and drink the coffee, and when you're done, gather your horses and clean them, because you're important people. That's essentially what he's saying. So this photograph was taken just about 3 weeks before he passed away. So that's public feasting, and Plenty Coup in particular. And Apsáalooke, that means it's over. It's done. So I'm done.